Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. On Thursday morning, I went through the usual routine, coffee brewing, the sound of kids scrambling for school, Claire checking her phone at the counter. Nothing felt off yet. We had fallen into a comfortable rhythm after 11 years of marriage, our routines running almost like clockwork. But as I watched her, her eyes flicking over the screen, her thumbs swiping quickly to dismiss whatever popped up, I realized how much of her world felt distant to me now. Our marriage hadn't always felt so disconnected. We'd had great years together. We loved each other, built a life, and shared dreams. But lately, something was off. Her schedule had become erratic, her work trips more frequent, and her mind seemed elsewhere. A few years ago, I would have dismissed it as stress or work demands, but a subtle, nagging suspicion had taken root. It was as if my mind was piecing together moments from months past, fragments of conversation, quiet nights, the widening gap between us. That day, as she headed out, she gave me a quick, distracted kiss on the cheek. "I'll be late tonight, another client dinner," she said, already halfway out the door. I nodded, swallowing back my questions. I watched her pull out of the driveway, her face glowing briefly as she picked up her phone again. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't pin down why. Later, while I was tidying up, I picked up her phone by accident, just for a moment, as it had lit up beside mine on the counter. She'd forgotten it while rushing to work, a rare oversight for her. For a second, I considered calling to let her know, but then I noticed a name on the screen, a name I didn't recognize, but something about it struck me wrong. Instead of calling, I put the phone down, determined to let the feeling go. But it lingered like a chill in the room. That evening, when Claire came home, she looked at her phone, brows furrowing slightly before her face returned to its usual calm. "Forgot my phone this morning, huh?" she said, almost too lightly. She wasn't prone to forgetfulness, which made the lapse seem odd. I nodded, sensing a tension in her that wasn't there before. Days passed, and I tried to dismiss the growing unease. I buried myself in work, took care of the kids, and focused on all the other things that needed my attention. But over the following weeks, I kept noticing those little signs, the unexplained late nights, her sudden need to step out for a call, and the way she'd hold her phone tightly whenever I was nearby, even taking it into the bathroom. It felt ridiculous to dwell on these things, but they began to add up, creating a picture I didn't want to see. Then one weekend, everything shifted. We had planned a family trip, but the morning before we were supposed to leave, Claire told me she couldn't go. "There's an emergency at work," she said, barely looking at me. I was disappointed, and it must have shown. She reached out, squeezing my hand in an attempt at reassurance. "I'm sorry. We can reschedule, maybe next month." Her words were reasonable, but the calm in her voice felt rehearsed. She left that afternoon, saying she'd be gone the whole weekend. And as she drove away, something snapped in me. I couldn't shake the suspicion any longer. After she left, I walked back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened her laptop. I didn't feel proud about it, but I needed answers. It wasn't something I wanted to find, but I had to look. I started with her emails, scrolling through inboxes and outboxes, finding mostly work-related stuff, family plans, the usual. But then, buried under the emails, I found an account I hadn't seen before. It was registered under a name that wasn't hers, though it used her maiden name as part of it. There was no reason for her to need a second email account. The address itself was odd, something she'd never use in any professional or personal setting with me. And the messages within, that's where I saw it all laid out. The messages were casual at first, jokes about work and sarcastic quips about her long hours, which I now realized she'd spent with him. The tone shifted over time, becoming more intimate. There were inside jokes, references to private dinners, plans made and reminisced over that I had never known about. Each line I read felt like a punch to the gut. Her words were flirtatious, warm, far too familiar for someone she supposedly just worked with. I read through every message, my anger and hurt building with each line. By the time I closed the laptop, my hands were trembling. I sat there, silent, staring at the screen as the betrayal settled over me. I spent that night trying to make sense of everything, replaying every recent conversation with her, every strange look and late-night call. It had been right in front of me all along, like a wound that only I had failed to see. The knowledge sat heavy, transforming my trust into something dark and bitter. I thought about confronting her the moment she walked in, about demanding an explanation. But some part of me held back, wanting more proof. I wanted to make sure there was no way she could spin this, no story she could tell that would make me doubt what I had seen. So I waited. When she came home Sunday evening, she acted as if everything was normal. She even wrapped her arms around me in the kitchen, asking about the kids and laughing when I told her about the things they'd done over the weekend. But I felt the hollow in her words, the disconnect between her laughter and the messages I had read. In that moment, I knew I needed to play this differently. Confronting her outright would just lead to arguments, denials, and probably some half-baked story about work stress or misunderstandings. No, I needed her to feel the weight of this, just as I was feeling it now. And that required patience. Over the next few weeks, I kept my discovery to myself. I acted like everything was normal, pretending to believe her lies, waiting for the right moment. It wasn't easy, especially on the nights she came home late, smiling faintly as she slipped into bed beside me. My mind raced through every piece of evidence I had gathered, every small detail that hinted at her betrayal. I let my anger simmer, but I kept my face neutral, biding my time. Then came the perfect opportunity. A friend's birthday party was approaching, and I knew from our previous conversations that he, her colleague, would be there. This was my chance to confront her in a way that would leave no room for doubt. I wanted her to know that I knew everything, that her lies had unraveled. The night of the party arrived, and I watched her get ready with her usual precision. She was radiant, smiling in a way that once would have made my heart ache with love. But now, it only fueled my resolve. As we drove to the party, she seemed oblivious, chatting about the people we'd see there and what a nice change it was to go out together. I listened, my silence stretching between us like a chasm. When we arrived, I immediately saw him across the room. He was everything I had expected, tall, confident, charming. He caught Claire's eye, and for a moment, she hesitated. She glanced at me, but I kept my expression blank, giving her no reason to suspect anything. The night unfolded slowly. I stayed close to Claire, watching her every move, noticing how she navigated the room with the same familiar ease, her charm turned up just enough to keep attention on her. She was brilliant at these social events, lighting up conversations with her easy laugh and knowing smiles. But as I observed her tonight, I could see the subtle changes, the extra effort she made to avoid looking in his direction, the way her eyes flicked towards him when she thought no one was watching. For a while, I let her enjoy herself, standing beside her as she mingled, pretending I was unaware of everything lurking beneath the surface. The charade was agonizing. Each time she laughed at someone's joke, or touched my arm as if we were the perfect couple, I felt a fresh wave of anger rise in me. But I kept my calm, knowing this night wasn't about confronting her just yet. It was about seeing the full picture. I wanted her to understand the extent of her betrayal, to see how far her deception had gone. Finally, the moment arrived. He approached our table, and I watched as she tensed, her smile faltering just slightly. She recovered quickly, glancing at me to gauge my reaction, but I kept my face impassive, even giving him a polite nod as he introduced himself. "Nice to meet you," he said, extending his hand, and I forced myself to shake it, looking him square in the eyes. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of recognition that told me he knew exactly who I was, and that he believed he had won. I saw the confidence in his stance, the smugness in his smile. He didn't view me as a threat, to him, I was simply the clueless husband. That arrogance only made my resolve harden. Claire tried to smooth over the tension, chatting nervously as if everything was normal, but her voice had a slight tremor, her laughter too forced. She was beginning to realize that she was standing on a knife's edge, but she wasn't sure why. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, and I could tell she sensed something was coming. As the night wore on, I kept her close, making small talk with mutual friends, never letting her drift too far away. Every time her lover passed by, I'd watch her carefully, noticing how her eyes would follow him, how her body shifted subtly in his direction. It was as if she was torn between us, uncertain whether to maintain her facade or follow her impulses. Near the end of the evening, I saw him slip towards the door leading to the balcony, casting a quick look at Claire before he stepped outside. She hesitated, glancing around the room, her gaze landing on me briefly before she looked away. She thought I was distracted, that I wouldn't notice her excusing herself, but I saw everything, the slight flush in her cheeks, the nervous flicker in her eyes. I followed her at a distance, slipping through the crowd, weaving my way to the same door. Out on the balcony, the two of them stood close, their voices low. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. I could see the familiar way she leaned towards him, her head tilted just so, the way she used to lean towards me in those quiet moments when we were still in love. My chest tightened, the anger building again, but I held back, waiting, watching. Finally, as if sensing someone watching, she turned and saw me standing there. Her face paled, her expression frozen. I stepped forward, locking eyes with her, letting her see the anger simmering just below the surface. Her lover glanced between us, his arrogance faltering as he realized the game was up. Claire opened her mouth as if to explain, to justify, but I raised a hand, stopping her. I wasn't interested in her excuses, not anymore. So, I said calmly, letting the word hang in the air. Is this what you've been hiding? She stammered, searching for the right words, her face a mixture of shock and fear. It's not what you think, she managed to say, her voice trembling. But I shook my head, unwilling to listen. The truth was out, and her lies meant nothing now. Her lover shifted uncomfortably, trying to maintain his composure. Look, I didn't know you'd. Didn't know I'd find out. I interrupted, my voice cold. I could see him shrinking under my gaze, his confidence eroding as he realized he'd miscalculated. I wanted him to feel the weight of his mistake, to understand just how deeply he'd underestimated me. Claire looked down, shame flickering in her eyes. She couldn't bring herself to meet my gaze, couldn't confront the pain she'd caused. I turned back to her, my anger finally spilling over. How long has this been going on? She mumbled something incoherent, barely above a whisper, and I felt my patience snap. Answer me, I demanded, my voice rising. For a moment, she looked at me, truly looked at me, and I saw the guilt and regret etched on her face. But it wasn't enough. Nothing she could say would erase what she'd done. It started a few months ago, she admitted, her voice barely audible. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. A mistake? Is that what you call this? I gestured between her and her lover, my hand shaking with anger. Sneaking around, lying to my face, all while pretending everything was fine. She bit her lip, her eyes filling with tears, but I didn't care. Her tears couldn't undo the betrayal, couldn't erase the image of her with him. I turned to leave, the weight of the evening pressing down on me, but before I could step back inside, she reached out, grabbing my arm. Please, let me explain, she whispered, her voice breaking. I made a mistake. I know that now. But I love you, I never stopped loving you. The words hit me like a blow, and for a moment, I faltered, memories flooding my mind, our wedding day, the years we spent building our life together, the love we once shared. But the memories were tainted now, poisoned by her lies. I looked at her, my heart aching, and shook my head. You don't get to say that, I said, my voice thick with anger and betrayal. You don't get to pretend this was a mistake, something you just stumbled into. You made a choice, Claire. You chose him over me. Her lover stood frozen, watching the scene unfold, unsure of what to do. I turned to him, my gaze icy. And you thought you could just waltz in and take what wasn't yours? He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't wait to hear it. I turned on my heel, walking back inside, leaving them both on the balcony. The sounds of the party faded into the background as I made my way through the crowd, barely registering the people around me. I could feel their eyes on me, whispers following in my wake, but I didn't care. I had nothing left to lose. As I stepped outside, the night air hit me, cool and refreshing, a stark contrast to the heat of my anger. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift slightly. I'd done it. I'd confronted her, forced her to face the truth. But as the adrenaline faded, a hollow emptiness settled in its place, the realization sinking in that my marriage, my life as I knew it, was over. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the night, wondering how it had all come to this. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying every word, every look, and every subtle shift of her expression. I was exhausted, but too restless to sleep. When I walked into our house, it felt strange, almost foreign, like it no longer belonged to me. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of our life together, family photos, the little trinkets she'd brought back from work trips, mementos of vacations, gifts we had exchanged. Each one now felt like a monument to her deception. I felt hollow, adrift in a house that had somehow become a stranger's. I poured myself a drink and sank into the couch, letting the silence settle over me. My thoughts kept drifting back to her face when she saw me on the balcony. I had never seen such fear and guilt in her eyes before. Part of me wanted to believe she was sorry, that maybe there was still something left to save, but each time that thought surfaced, I remembered the way she'd looked at him. It was the same way she used to look at me. I sat in the silence, feeling the weight of the betrayal pressing down on me. I knew I couldn't live like this, stuck between anger and regret. The confrontation had been brutal, but necessary. I had to be clear-eyed about the future, about what came next. And that meant taking action, not sitting here wallowing in what she'd done. The next morning, I called a lawyer. My decision felt cold and final, but it was liberating in a way. There was no point in waiting, no sense in dragging out something that had already died. We discussed my options, the division of assets, the custody of our 2 children, and how best to proceed. I didn't want to take any missteps that would give her leverage later. I wanted a clean break, something definitive. As I hung up the phone, my mind went to our kids. They had been with Claire's parents for the weekend, sparing them from the storm brewing between us. I dreaded the conversation I would have to have with them. How could I explain that their mother had shattered our family? I felt a fresh wave of anger, but also a pang of sadness for everything they would lose because of her choices. Later that day, Claire returned. She walked in cautiously, her face pale, eyes searching mine. I stood up, meeting her gaze, my jaw clenched. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "Before you say anything," I said, "I've already spoken to a lawyer." The color drained from her face. "Wait, please, don't do this. We can fix this. We can try counseling, anything. Just give me a chance." I shook my head, the bitterness seeping into my voice. "You had your chance, Claire. Every day, every moment you were with him, you had a chance to stop. But you didn't. You kept lying, pretending, making me look like a fool." She reached out to me, but I pulled back. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. I don't know what I was thinking. I thought." "You thought what?" I interrupted. "That I'd never find out. That you could just keep living this double life, and I'd keep being the oblivious husband." She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "It wasn't like that. I know I hurt you, but it's not as simple as you think." "Oh, it's not." I said, my voice laced with sarcasm. You spent months, maybe years, sneaking around, lying to me, putting on this act. And you're telling me it's complicated? Her face crumpled, and she looked down, wringing her hands. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know I messed up, but please, please, don't do this. Don't throw everything away. Throw everything away? I repeated, incredulous. That's rich, coming from you. You're the one who threw it all away. You made that decision the first time you went to him. This isn't on me, Claire. This is on you. She fell silent, her shoulders slumped, her gaze fixed on the floor. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity. But it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the anger and betrayal simmering inside me. I couldn't afford to feel sorry for her. Not now. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Is there anything I can do to change your mind? I looked at her, taking in the desperation in her eyes, the faint hope she clung to. But there was nothing she could say that would erase what she'd done. I shook my head. No, Claire. It's over. The words hung heavy in the air, final and unyielding. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. She nodded, as if accepting her fate, and turned to leave. But before she reached the door, I called out. One more thing, I said, my voice cold. I want you to tell the kids. You owe them the truth. They deserve to know why their family is falling apart. She flinched, but she nodded. I'll tell them, she whispered, her voice breaking. I watched her leave, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. Part of me wanted to call her back, to take back everything I'd said, but I knew it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no going back. I had to let her go, even if it meant breaking my own heart in the process. In the days that followed, we worked out the logistics of our separation. She stayed in the guest room, avoiding me whenever possible, her presence a ghostly reminder of the life we'd lost. Every time I saw her, the anger flared up anew, but I forced myself to keep my emotions in check. There was no point in arguing, no sense in reopening old wounds. The decision had been made. One evening, a week after the confrontation, I came home to find the house quiet, Claire nowhere in sight. I found a note on the kitchen counter, scrawled in her handwriting, I'll be staying with my parents for a while. I'll see the kids on the weekends. I'm sorry for everything. I stared at the note, feeling an odd mixture of relief and sadness. She was gone, finally out of my life, but the emptiness she left behind was overwhelming. The silence in the house was deafening, each room a hollow echo of the life we'd once shared. For a while, I wandered through the house, unable to shake the memories that clung to every corner. The kitchen, where we'd shared countless meals and laughter. The living room, where we'd spent quiet evenings together, her head resting on my shoulder. The bedroom, now a cold and empty space, stripped of the warmth and intimacy we'd once shared. I sank onto the couch, feeling the weight of the loss settle over me. I had wanted revenge, to make her feel the pain she had inflicted on me, but now that she was gone, all I felt was a hollow ache. The anger had burned out, leaving only a lingering sadness and regret. The weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of life began to shift, filling the empty spaces Claire had left behind. The kids were adapting, finding their own ways to cope, though they asked about her constantly. I'd told them only what they needed to know, that we had grown apart, that sometimes people change in ways that make it hard to stay together. But Claire's betrayal, the raw truth, stayed buried. I saw no need to drag them into the depths of it, to color their memories of their mother with something they didn't need to carry. Every weekend, she came to pick them up, standing at the door with a cautious smile, never stepping beyond the threshold. We exchanged only the necessary words, updates about school, drop-off times, nothing more. Each encounter reminded me of everything we'd lost, but I could feel myself healing, slowly stitching the pieces of my life back together. One evening, as I was sorting through the files in our home office, I stumbled upon an old storage box tucked away in the closet. I couldn't remember the last time I'd gone through it. Inside were scattered pieces of our history, photos from family vacations, birthday cards from years past, ticket stubs from our first concert together. I felt a pang, realizing these were relics of a life that now felt distant, almost foreign. At the bottom of the box was a small, velvet-covered notebook I didn't recognize. Curious, I opened it, skimming the first few pages, quickly realizing it was Claire's journal. My heart pounded as I debated whether to read it, feeling conflicted about invading her privacy. But something in me, the part still aching for closure, needed answers. The entries started years back, detailing mundane moments of her life, grocery lists, work stresses, musings about the kids. But as I read on, the tone shifted. She'd written about feeling lost, struggling with an emptiness she couldn't explain. She described how she felt trapped between the life she'd chosen and the dreams she'd left behind. She wrote about her growing disconnect with me, the moments she felt unseen, the times she questioned if she had settled too soon. Then I reached an entry from nearly a year before our confrontation at the party. She spoke of meeting someone, a man who made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. I skimmed forward, reading her words as she documented their affair, the guilt that shadowed every encounter, and the shame that gnawed at her in the quiet hours of the night. She admitted to feeling torn, unable to leave me and the life we'd built, but equally unable to let go of the new life she'd found in secret. One entry, dated just weeks before the party, stopped me cold. I don't know how to end this. I feel like I'm suffocating, like I'm two people in one skin, and both of them are miserable. I don't want to hurt him. He's a good man, a wonderful father, and he deserves so much better. But I feel trapped. Sometimes, I think the only way out would be if he found out, if he caught us. Maybe that's what I want, to be forced to confront this, to be free from my own lies. My hands trembled as I closed the notebook, her words ringing in my ears. She had wanted me to find out. She hadn't intended to leave, or even to make a decision. She'd let the weight of her actions build, hoping it would come crashing down, dragging both of us with it. The affair hadn't been about love, or even desire, it had been about escape, a desperate attempt to claw her way out of a life she no longer recognized. I sat there for a long time, the silence pressing in around me. I'd spent months hating her, feeling the sting of betrayal like a wound that refused to heal. But now, reading her words, I felt an odd mixture of sadness and relief. I could finally see it for what it was. Her affair wasn't just a betrayal, it was a cry for help that I had been too blind to hear. The sound of my phone jolted me back to reality. I picked it up, surprised to see her name on the screen. We hadn't spoken outside of drop-offs and pickups, and a call from her was unusual. I hesitated, then answered. "Hi," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Hi," she replied, her voice soft. I know this is strange, but I wanted to talk. Just for a few minutes." "About?" There was a long pause, and I could hear her take a breath. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. Really sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, and it's probably too late, but I wanted you to hear it. I hurt you, and I hate myself for it." I didn't know what to say, the words in her journal still fresh in my mind. "Why now?" I asked quietly. "I think, because I finally understand what I did," she said, her voice catching. "At the time, I thought I was looking for something I couldn't find in us. But now, being away from you, from the kids, I realize I wasn't looking for someone else. I was just trying to run from myself." I felt a strange sense of clarity, as if I'd finally reached the end of a journey I hadn't even known I was on. "I found your journal," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know you wanted me to find out about the affair. That you were hoping I would stop you." She inhaled sharply, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "I didn't know what else to do," she said eventually. I was scared, confused. I didn't want to lose you, but I couldn't find a way to reach you. I know it doesn't excuse anything, but maybe it explains a little. We sat in silence, the weight of everything that had happened settling between us. For the first time, I felt a faint flicker of understanding, the anger melting away, leaving only a quiet sorrow. Where do we go from here? She asked, her voice small. I don't know, I admitted. But I think, for the first time, I'm willing to try to figure that out. The line was quiet, her breathing soft, steady. It wasn't forgiveness I felt, not yet, but a sliver of something gentler, something that whispered of closure, or maybe even a chance to rebuild. I didn't know what the future held, or if we could ever find our way back to each other. But in that moment, with the hurt laid bare between us, I felt hope, small, fragile, but real. Perhaps, just perhaps, we weren't entirely beyond repair.